What happens when you ask God for answers? And all you get is silence. You've been asking again and again. And instead of clarity, you're stuck in that quiet tension where nothing makes sense. Your mind won't stop. Your prayers feel heavier. And deep down, there's a question you don't even want to admit. What if he's not answering you? Because it's not just about your situation anymore. Now it feels personal. Like you're doing everything right, still believing, still praying, but something inside you is starting to shake. And the longer the silence stretches, the harder it is to ignore what it's doing to you. You expect a direction, something clear, something you could hold on to. But instead, you're here, still waiting, still wondering, still trying to figure out what this silence actually means. And that's where it starts to break you. Because when God feels quiet, your mind starts filling in the gaps. So what if the silence you're struggling with isn't what you think it is? You've been carrying questions for longer than you want to admit. They don't just pass through your mind anymore. They sit there heavy, persistent, returning at the quietest moments. Sometimes it happens when you're alone. Sometimes in the middle of your day, when everything looks normal on the outside. But inside there's this quiet tension you can't fully explain. You've asked God more than once, maybe many times, and still, the answer hasn't come the way you expected. You replay the same thoughts. Why is this happening? Why hasn't anything changed? Did I misunderstand something? Did I miss his voice? And slowly, without even realizing it, those questions begin to shift. They stop being just about your situation and start becoming questions about God himself. Because when the silence stretches longer than you expected, it starts to feel personal. You don't necessarily lose your faith. That's what makes this even more complicated. You still believe in God. You still pray. You still try to trust. But something inside you feels unsettled. There's a tension between what you believe is true and what you're experiencing right now. And that tension is exhausting. Prayer becomes different in seasons like this. It's no longer just words. It carries emotion, sometimes frustration, sometimes confusion, sometimes even fear. Not the kind of fear that makes you run away from God, but the kind that whispers quietly, "What if he's not answering me?" And you may not say that out loud. You may not even want to admit that thought fully, but it lingers in the background of your mind because you expected something clearer, something more direct. Maybe a sign, maybe a strong sense of direction, maybe a breakthrough that would make everything make sense. But instead, what you got was silence, or at least that's what it feels like. And that's where the struggle really begins. Because silence leaves room for interpretation. And when your mind is already tired, already overwhelmed, it doesn't always interpret things in a healthy way. It starts filling in the gaps. Maybe God is distant. Maybe he's waiting for me to figure something out. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe I'm not hearing him because I'm not spiritual enough. And the more you think like this, the heavier it gets. It's not just about getting an answer anymore. It's about trying to understand what the silence means. And that question, what does this silence mean, can become louder than the original problem itself. You try to stay grounded. You remind yourself of what you know. You've heard that God listens. You've heard that he cares. You've read that he invites you to ask, to seek, to knock. You've seen it in Scripture, the way God reveals himself, the way he speaks, the way he guides. The Bible presents his word as something reliable, something that reveals who he is, what he's doing, and even where everything is heading. So why does it feel so unclear right now? That's the tension you're living in, not between belief and unbelief, but between expectation and reality, between what you thought would happen when you asked God and what is actually happening. Because deep down, maybe without realizing it, you expected that asking would lead to clarity, that if you were sincere, if your heart was in the right place, God would respond in a way you could recognize immediately, that he would remove the confusion, that he would give you something solid to hold on to. But instead, you're still here, still thinking, still wondering, still waiting. And waiting has a way of exposing things. It brings your thoughts to the surface. It reveals how much you want control, how much you want certainty, how uncomfortable it is to not know what is coming next. And suddenly, your prayer is no longer just about the situation you started with. It becomes about your need for answers. And that's where it gets even more complex. Because now you're not just asking God to change something, you're asking Him to explain something, to make sense of what feels confusing, to give you a reason that settles your mind. And when that explanation doesn't come, it can feel like you're left alone with your thoughts. But here's something you may not have fully considered yet. What if the silence you're experiencing isn't empty? What if it's not the absence of God, but the presence of something you don't yet understand? Because it's possible to be waiting and still be in the middle of something God is doing. The problem is, it doesn't always feel that way. It feels like standing still, like being paused while everything else keeps moving, like being in between clarity and confusion, not fully in either one. And that space, that in-between space, is where your mind works the hardest. You analyze everything. You go back over your prayers. You wondered if you said something wrong, believed something incorrectly, or missed a moment when God was trying to speak. You question your own perception. You question your own spiritual sensitivity. An overthinking that can quietly wear you down. Because the real weight isn't just the unanswered question. It's the uncertainty of what it means. Does silence mean wait? Does it mean no? Does it mean not yet? Or does it mean something deeper that he not seeing? You don't have a clear answer to that right now. And that's exactly what makes this so difficult. But maybe the real issue isn't just that you don't have an answer. Maybe it's that you've assumed what an answer is supposed to look like. And if that assumption is off, then everything you're interpreting right now might be off too. Because what if God has not been silent in the way you think He has? What if the problem is not that He hasn't answered, but that the answer doesn't match your expectation? That possibility might feel uncomfortable, even confusing, but it opens a different kind of question. Not just, why isn't God answering me? But what if I'm looking for the wrong kind of answer? And if that's true, then something deeper is happening beneath the surface of everything you're feeling right now. Something that has less to do with getting immediate clarity and more to do with understanding what's really going on inside your heart. And that's where this journey begins to shift. There's something happening beneath your questions that you may not have fully noticed yet. On the surface, it feels like you're just asking God for answers. But if you slow down for a moment, if you really pay attention to what's going on inside, you might begin to see that your questions are revealing something deeper. Because asking God doesn't just bring clarity about your situation. It reveals the condition of your heart, and that can be uncomfortable. At first, you think your struggle is about not knowing what to do, but over Chimi you begin to realize it's also about not being in control. You want clarity? Yes, but more than that, you want certainty. You want something solid. Something that removes the risk, something that allows you to move forward without fear. And there's nothing strange about that. It's human. But here's where things begin to shift. Because when your prayers are driven by the need for certainty, they can slowly become less about trust and more about control. You may not say it that way. You may not even intend it that way. But if you look closely, you'll notice it. The urgency behind your questions, the weight behind your waiting. The frustration when things don't become clear quickly. It's not just that you want an answer, it's that you want an answer now. And not just any answer, you want one that makes sense to you. One that aligns with what you expect. One that removes the discomfort you're feeling. But what if that expectation is shaping the way you experience God? What if the issue is not just that you're waiting, but that you're defining what a real answer should look like? Because if your definition is too narrow, you might miss what God is already doing. This is where prayer becomes more revealing than you expected. You come to God thinking you're bringing a question, but in the process, something else is exposed. Your fears begin to surface. The fear of making the wrong decision. The fear of being stuck. The fear of being forgotten. The fear that maybe things won't turn out the way you hoped. And those fears don't always show up clearly. Sometimes they hide behind your logic. They disguise themselves as reasonable concerns, but they're there, quietly influencing how you think, how you feel, and how you interpret God's silence. Because when fear is present, silence feels heavier. It feels like distance, like absence, like uncertainty with no direction. But what if what you're feeling isn't actually coming from God's silence, But from what is being uncovered inside you during the silence, that changes the perspective completely. Because now, instead of only asking, "Why isn't God answering me?" you begin to ask, "What is this waiting revealing about me?" And that question can lead you somewhere deeper than you expected. You start to notice patterns in your thoughts. The way your mind keeps going back to the same concerns. The way you try to predict outcomes. The way you mentally rehearse different scenarios, hoping one of them will finally feel right. But none of them fully settle your heart. Because the real issue isn't just finding the right scenario. It's finding peace in the middle of uncertainty. And that's not something your mind can easily produce on its own. This is why waiting feels so intense. Because it forces you to face what you usually try. To avoid the reality that you don't control everything, that you don't see the full picture, that even your best reasoning has limits. And in that space, two things begin to compete inside you: faith and fear. Faith reminds you of what is true, that God is good, that He sees what you can't see, that He is present even when you don't feel it, that His timing is not random. But fear challenges all of that. It tells you that something is wrong, that you're falling behind, that if you don't figure this out quickly, you might make a mistake you can't fix, that maybe you've been overlooked. And the longer you stay in that tension, the louder those thoughts can become. So you try to resolve it. You think harder, you pray more intensely, you look for signs, you analyze every small detail, hoping something will finally stand out and give you clarity. But instead of peace, you often end up more overwhelmed, because you're trying to use certainty to quiet something that actually requires trust. And that's a difficult shift. Because trust doesn't give you all the details you want. It doesn't always explain everything up front. It doesn't remove every unknown. But it invites you into something different. It invites you to rely on God, not just for answers, but for stability. And that's not what most people expect when they pray. Most people approach prayer as a way to solve something, to get direction, to receive clarity. And those things matter. They're part of how God works. But prayer is also something else. It's a place where your inner world is exposed to truth, where your thoughts are confronted, where your motives are refined, where your dependence is tested not to weaken you, but to strengthen something deeper than your need for immediate answers. Because if your faith only feels steady when everything is clear, then what happens when clarity doesn't come right away? Does that mean God has failed, or that your understanding of faith needs to grow? That question sits quietly, but it matters because it points to something you're beginning to realize, even if you can't fully articulate it yet. Maybe this season is not just about getting an answer. Maybe it's about becoming the kind of person who can trust God even before the answer arrives. And that kind of trust doesn't develop in moments of instant clarity. It develops in moments like this. Moments where you're still unsure, still waiting, still feeling the tension between what you know is true and what you feel in your mind. And that's where something important begins to take shape. Not outside of you, but inside. Because as much as you want God to change your situation, He may be doing something just as significant, if not more, in the way you think, the way you trust, and the way you relate to Him. But that raises another question. If this process is actually shaping something deeper in you, then what exactly is God doing in the silence? And why does it feel so hard to recognize it while you're in the middle of it? There's a subtle shift that needs to happen in the way you see this silence. Right now, it feels like something is missing, like there should be a response, a sign, a clear direction, and because it hasn't come the way you expected, your mind interprets that as absence. But what if silence is not the absence of God, but a different form of His presence? That idea can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable, because you've been conditioned to associate God's presence with clarity, with movement, with something you can recognize and hold on to. But throughout Scripture, God doesn't always work that way. He invites people to trust Him not only when He speaks clearly, but also when He seems quiet. And that kind of trust doesn't come naturally, because silence forces you into a place where your usual ways of finding security no longer work. You can't rely on immediate answers. You can't depend on visible confirmation. You can't move forward based on certainty. Instead, you're left with something deeper. and more difficult: dependence. And that's exactly what makes this season feel so intense. Because dependence means you have to trust God without having everything explained. It means you have to continue walking even when you don't fully understand where the path is leading. It means you have to lean on truth instead of your feelings, and that's where the internal tension becomes even clearer. Your feelings are loud. They tell you that something is wrong, that if God were truly present, you would feel more peace, more clarity, more direction. They push you to resolve the uncertainty as quickly as possible. But truth speaks differently. Truth reminds you that God's presence is not dependent on your perception, that He is not limited by your ability to recognize what He's doing, that His work often happens beneath the surface in ways you cannot immediately see. And that creates a conflict inside you, because what you feel and what is true don't always match. You feel forgotten, but truth says you are seen. You feel uncertain, but truth says God is still in control. You feel like nothing is happening, but truth suggests something deeper may be unfolding. So which one do you trust? That's the real question beneath your struggle. Because if you allow your feelings to define reality, then silence will always feel like distance. But if you begin to anchor yourself in truth within, when your emotions don't align, something starts to change. Not necessarily your circumstances right away, but your perspective. You begin to realize that silence is not empty. It's not passive. It's not meaningless. It's intentional. Not in a way that is meant to frustrate you, but in a way that is meant to grow something in you that cannot develop any other way. Because think about it, if every time you asked God for something, He responded immediately with full clarity, what would happen to your faith? Would it grow, or would it become dependent on constant reassurance? Would you trust Him, or just rely on quick answers? These are uncomfortable questions, but they matter. Because faith that only survives in clarity is fragile. It depends on circumstances. It depends on outcomes. It depends on everything making sense. But real faith, the kind that sustains you through uncertainty, is built differently. It's built in moments like this. Moments where you don't have all the answers, but you choose to trust anyway. Moments where your mind is still asking questions, but your heart is slowly learning to rest. Moments where you stop demanding immediate explanations and start allowing God to work in ways you don't fully understand. And that process takes time. It doesn't happen instantly. It doesn't remove all your questions overnight. It doesn't silence every anxious thought at once, but it begins to shift something inside you. You'll become less reactive to the silence. I'm more open to what He might be producing, because instead of seeing it as a problem to solve, you start seeing it as a space where something is being formed. A deeper trust, a steadier mind, a faith that is not controlled by emotions. And yet, even as you begin to understand this, there's still a part of you that wonders, if God is present in the silence, why does it still feel so unclear? Why doesn't He just make things obvious? Why allow this kind of tension at all? Those questions don't disappear. They evolve. Because now, you're not just questioning the silence, you're trying to understand the way God chooses to communicate. And that leads to something important, because maybe the issue isn't that God isn't speaking. Maybe it's that you've been expecting Him to speak in only one way. And if that's true, then there's a whole dimension of how God communicates that you might not have fully recognized yet. Which means the answer you've been waiting for might already be closer than you think. At some point, you start to realize that the issue may not be that God isn't answering, but that you've been expecting His answer to look a certain way. And that expectation shapes everything. Because when you imagine how God should respond, you usually picture something clear, undeniable, and immediate. A strong impression. A direct sign. A moment where everything suddenly makes sense and all your doubts disappear. But what if God's way of answering is often quieter than that? What if His voice doesn't always interrupt your life, but gently meets you within it? This is where many people struggle without even realizing it, because they're listening for something dramatic. While God is speaking in something consistent, you're waiting for a moment, but God may be giving you a pattern. And if you're only paying attention to what feels obvious, you might overlook what is actually steady. Think about it. How often do you open Scripture, read something, and feel like it speaks directly to your situation, but then you dismiss it because it doesn't feel specific enough? How often do you feel a quiet conviction something inside you, gently guiding you away from a certain direction or toward a different one, but you hesitate because it's not loud or certain? How often has wise counsel come into your life through someone you trust, aligning with truth, but you question it because it doesn't match what you were hoping to hear? These moments matter more than you think, because God's voice often brings truth before it brings details. It gives you direction before it gives you the full picture. And that can feel frustrating when you want clarity about everything. But there's a reason for it. Because if God showed you every detail all at once, you wouldn't need to walk by faith. You would simply follow information. And faith was never meant to be replaced by certainty. It was meant to guide you through uncertainty. So instead of overwhelming you with everything at once, God often leads you one step at a time, a truth that anchors you, a conviction that redirects you, a sense of peace that doesn't fully explain itself but steadies you anyway. And here's where it becomes easy to miss, because these forms of guidance don't always feel dramatic. They don't always remove all your questions. They don't always give you a complete answer, but they are answers, just not in the form you expected. And if you're not careful, you can overlook them, not because God isn't speaking, but because His voice doesn't match the volume you were waiting for. This is why discernment becomes so important, because not every thought you have comes from truth. Not every feeling you experience reflects reality. Your mind can create noise, especially when you're anxious, tired, or overwhelmed. So how do you recognize what is from God? It doesn't start with intensity. It starts with alignment. God's voice aligns with His word. It reflects His character. It leads toward truth, not confusion. It may challenge you, but it doesn't contradict what He has already revealed. And that matters. Because while your thoughts may shift from day to day, truth remains consistent. That's why Scripture becomes so important in seasons like this. Not as a place to search for random answers, but as a foundation that shapes how you think, how you interpret your situation, and how you discern what is actually coming from God. The Bible presents itself as God's reliable revelation, showing who He is, how He works, and what ultimately matters. And when your mind feels unstable, that kind of reliability is what keeps you grounded. Because instead of chasing every possible explanation, you begin to filter your thoughts through truth. You begin to notice the difference between anxiety and conviction. Anxiety rushes you. It pressures you. It demands immediate resolution. It fills your mind with what-ifs and worst-case scenarios. Conviction, on the other hand, is steady. It may be quiet, but it's clear. It doesn't panic. It points you in a direction, even if it doesn't explain everything. And peace often comes before understanding. Not the kind of peace that solves everything, but the kind that settles your heart enough to take the next step. And that's where many people hesitate, because taking a step without full clarity feels risky. But what if that's exactly how God leads? Not by showing you the entire path, but by giving you enough light for the next step. And if you keep waiting for everything to make sense before you move, you might stay stuck longer than necessary. Not because God hasn't guided you, but because you've been waiting for a different kind of guidance. So now the question changes again. Not just why hasn't God answered me, but have I been overlooking the ways He already has? And that question requires honesty, because it asks you to reconsider your expectations, to slow down your thinking, to pay attention not just to what feels obvious, but to what has been consistent. And maybe, as you reflect on that, you begin to notice something, that God has not been as silent as you thought, that in the middle of your questions, there have been moments of clarity, small, quiet, easy to dismiss, but real. Moments where truth became clearer. Moments where a certain direction felt right, even if you couldn't explain why. Moments where something inside you was being gently shaped. And if that's true, then maybe the silence you've been struggling with isn't about the absence of answers. Maybe it's about learning how to recognize them. But that leads to something deeper, because even if you begin to see that God is guiding you, there's still the challenge of staying steady while you wait for the full picture. And that's where the next struggle begins. How do you remain at peace when your emotions are still unstable? How do you keep trusting when clarity is still incomplete? Because recognizing God's voice is one thing, but learning to rest in it even without all the answers. That's something else entirely. Even when you begin to recognize that God may be speaking in quieter ways, even when you start to see that his answers don't always look like what you expected, there's still something that doesn't fully settle inside you. Because understanding something and living in it are not the same. You may see the truth more clearly now. You may even agree with it. But your emotions don't always follow that clarity right away. Your mind still drifts. Your thoughts still race. Some days feel steady, and others feel just as uncertain as before. And that can be frustrating, because part of you thinks, if I understand this now, why do I still feel this way? But that question reveals something important. Growth doesn't happen instantly, especially when it comes to trust. Because trust is not just something you decide once, it's something that gets built over time, especially in moments where your feelings are unstable. And that's exactly where you are right now, in a place where what you feel and what you know are still learning how to align. Because your emotions respond to what is immediate, what is visible, what feels urgent. They react quickly. They shift easily. And when you're in a season of waiting, they can become even more intense. One moment, you feel at peace. The next, your mind is full of questions. Again, one day, you feel confident in God's direction. The next, you're second-guessing everything, and it creates this internal cycle that can be exhausting. But here's what you need to understand. This instability doesn't mean your faith is failing. It means your faith is being formed. Because stable faith is not the absence of fluctuating emotions, it's the ability to remain anchored in truth, even when your emotions move. And that kind of stability doesn't come naturally. It's developed. And one of the main ways it develops is through waiting, not passive waiting, not just sitting still, hoping something changes, but active waiting where you continue to trust, continue to align your thoughts with truth, continue to take small steps forward, even when you don't feel completely certain. And that's where many people struggle, because they think waiting means doing nothing. But in reality, waiting is deeply active. It's choosing not to let fear control your decisions. It's choosing not to let anxiety define your perspective. It's choosing to come back to truth again and again, even when your mind tries to pull you somewhere else. And that takes effort. Not the kind of effort that forces outcomes, but the kind that keeps your heart steady. Because without that intentional focus, your mind will naturally drift back to what feels urgent. And what feels urgent is not always what is true. That's why your thoughts matter so much in this process. Because the longer you sit in uncertainty, the more your mind will try to fill the gaps. It will imagine possibilities, create scenarios, anticipate outcomes, most of which are driven by fear, not truth. And if you don't become aware of that, those thoughts can start to feel real. They can shape your emotions. They can influence your decisions. They can distort the way you see God. So part of this season is not just about waiting for answers. It's about learning how to manage your thoughts while you wait. Learning to recognize when your mind is drifting into fear and gently bringing it back to truth. Learning to pause before reacting emotionally and asking yourself, is this thought grounded in truth or is it coming from anxiety? Learning to sit with uncertainty without immediately trying to escape it. And that last part is especially difficult because your instinct is to resolve discomfort as quickly as possible. But growth often happens when you don't rush to escape it, when you allow the process to unfold, even when it's slow, even when it's unclear, because something is happening in that process. Your dependence on immediate clarity is being reduced. Your ability to trust without full understanding is being strengthened. Your mind is learning to rest, even when it doesn't have all the answers. And that kind of transformation doesn't happen overnight. It happens through repetition, through moments where you choose truth over fear, through moments where you stay grounded, even when your emotions pull you in different directions, through moments where you resist the urge to and instead choose to trust what God has already shown you. And slowly, almost quietly, begin to notice a shift. You're not as easily shaken as before. Your thoughts don't spiral as quickly. Your need for immediate answers starts to lose its intensity. Not because everything is clear, but because something inside you is becoming steady. And that steadiness is not coming from having control. It's coming from trust. a trust that is no longer dependent on constant reassurance, a trust that can exist even in the middle of unanswered questions. But even as this trust begins to grow, there's still one question that lingers in the background. If God is shaping you through this waiting, if He's building something deeper in your faith, then what about the things you're still asking for? What about the prayers that still seem unanswered? Because it's one thing to grow through the process, but it's another to understand why some answers still haven't come at all. And that question leads you to something even deeper. Because maybe the delay is not just about timing. Maybe it's about something you haven't fully seen yet. At this point, you've started to understand that waiting is not empty, that God is not absent, that something is being formed in you through this process. But there's still a part of your heart that quietly asks, what about the things I've been praying for? Because even with all this growth, the reality remains some answers still haven't come. And that's where this becomes deeply personal. Because it's not just about learning to trust in general. It's about trusting God with specific things that matter to you. Things that carry weight. Things that affect your future, your direction, your peace. And when those things remain unresolved, it can feel confusing. Not because you don't believe God is able, but because you don't understand why He hasn't acted. And this is where one of the most difficult truths begins to surface. Not every unanswered prayer is a delayed yes. Sometimes what feels like silence is actually protection. But that's not easy to accept, because from your perspective, what you're asking for makes sense. It feels right. It feels necessary. You've thought it through. You've prayed about it. You've tried to align it with what you believe is good. So when the answer doesn't come, more doesn't come the way you expected, it can feel like something is being withheld. But what if it is not being withheld? What if it's being filtered? Because God sees what you can't see. Not just the present moment, but the full picture. The outcomes, the consequences, the paths that are hidden from you right now. And in that perspective, He is not just responding to your request, He is responding to your future. And sometimes, the most loving answer is not immediate approval. It's protection from something you don't yet recognize. But there's more. Because not every delay is about protection. Sometimes, it's about redirection. You may be focused on one outcome, one possibility, one specific way things should unfold, and without realizing it, your prayers become centered around that expectation. God, make this work. God, open this door. God, let this happen. But what if that door is not leading where you think it is? What if your understanding of what's best is limited by what you can currently see? Because it's possible to be sincere and still be incomplete in your perspective. And God, in His wisdom, doesn't just respond to your sincerity, He responds to what is actually best for you, even if it doesn't feel that way at first, even if it disrupts your plans, even if it forces you into a different direction than the one you were expecting. And that's where trust reaches a deeper level. Because now it's not just about trusting God when things make sense. It's about trusting Him when they don't, when the path changes, when the answer is different, when the waiting continues longer than you thought it would. And in those moments, something inside you has to decide, will you hold on to your expectation or will you open your hands? Because sometimes the very thing you're asking for is the thing God is gently leading you away from. Not to take something from you, but to give you something better, something you don't fully understand yet. And then there's another layer to this: preparation. Because there are things you're asking for that may be good, but you may not yet be ready to carry them. Not in the way you are now. Because what you receive in the wrong season can become a burden instead of a blessing. And God, who sees beyond this moment, prepares you before He positions you. Which means the waiting is not just about the answer. It's about who you are becoming before the answer arrives. Your patience is being stretched. Your character is being shaped. Your dependence on God is being deepened, not to delay your life, but to align it. Because when the timing is right, and when your heart is ready, the answer won't just arrive, it will fit. And that changes how you see this entire process. Because now, instead of asking, why hasn't God answered me yet? You begin to ask, what is He protecting me from? Where might he be redirecting me? How is he preparing me right now? And those questions don't come from frustration. They come from trust. A trust that believes God is not ignoring you, but intentionally leading you, even when you don't fully understand how. And yet, even with this perspective, there's still one final tension that needs to be resolved. Because you can understand all of this and still feel the weight of not knowing everything. You can accept that God is working and still wish you had more clarity. So, how do you live with that? How do you move forward when some questions remain unanswered? Because at the end of all this, you're still walking without having the full picture. And that's where everything comes together. Not in having every answer, but in becoming someone who no longer needs them to keep trusting. At the end of all these questions, all this waiting, all this internal tension, you begin to realize something that quietly changes everything. The goal was never to have every answer. It was to learn how to trust God, even without them. And that realization doesn't come all at once. It settles in slowly. Through moments where you stop trying to force clarity. Through moments where your mind is still asking questions, but your heart is no longer restless in the same way. Because something inside you has shifted. You're no longer standing in the same place you were at the beginning. At first, you were searching for explanations. You needed to understand what God was doing, why He was allowing certain things, when things would change. Your peace was tied to having those answers. But now you're beginning to see that peace was never meant to come from knowing everything. It comes from knowing Him. And that changes how you carry your questions. Because the questions may still be there, but they no longer control you. They no longer create the same anxiety. They no longer dominate your thoughts. They no longer make you feel like everything is uncertain. Not because everything is clear, but because you found something steadier than clarity. Trust. A trust that is not based on outcomes. A trust that is not dependent on immediate answers. A trust that doesn't collapse when things take longer than expected. And that kind of trust creates something you may not have felt in a long time. Peace. Not the kind of peace that explains everything, but the kind that allows you to rest, even when things are still unfolding. Because now, instead of constantly asking, what is going to happen? Your heart begins to settle into a different question. Can I trust God with what I don't understand yet? And the answer to that question is no longer theoretical. You've been living it through the waiting, through the silence, through the moments where you had to choose truth over fear again and again. And now you begin to see it more clearly. God was not ignoring you. He was guiding you. Not always with detailed explanations, but with enough truth to keep you moving forward, enough light for the next step, enough clarity to keep you grounded, because that's how He works. He doesn't always reveal the full picture, but He never leaves you without direction. And that's an important distinction, because it means you were never truly without an answer. You just didn't always recognize it in the form it came. And now, as you look back, you can start to see it. The moments where truth became clearer, the times where you were gently redirected, the quiet ways your thinking began to change, the strength that started to develop inside you. None of that was accidental. It was intentional. It was part of something deeper than just solving a situation. It was about shaping your faith. Because a faith that depends on immediate clarity is fragile, but a faith that learns to trust in the middle of uncertainty, that faith becomes steady. And that steadiness changes how you move forward from here. Because now, you don't need to have everything figured out before you take the next step. You don't need every question answered before you obey what you already know is right. You don't need constant reassurance to believe that God is with you. You can move even with partial understanding. You can act even when things are still unfolding. You can trust even when the outcome is not fully clear. And that is freedom. Freedom from overthinking every detail. Freedom from trying to control every outcome. Freedom from the pressure of needing everything to make sense right now. Because your confidence is no longer in your ability to understand everything. It's in God's ability to lead you, even when you don't. And that's where the transformation becomes real. You're no longer the person who is stuck in the tension between faith and fear. You're becoming someone who knows how to navigate that tension with trust. Not perfectly, not without questions, but with a steadiness that wasn't there before. And that's enough. Because at the end of the day, the goal was never to eliminate every doubt. It was to learn how to walk with God, even when doubts try to appear, to ask honestly without losing trust, to wait patiently without losing peace, to move forward even when everything is not fully explained. And if you've made it this far, something inside you already understands that. Maybe not completely, but enough to take the next step. So wherever you are right now, still waiting, still processing, still holding questions, remember this: God may not always give immediate answers, but He always gives enough truth for you to keep trusting Him, and that is what will carry you forward. If this message helped you, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who might be going through a similar season, and subscribe to the channel for more reflections like this. And as you continue your journey, hold on to this thought: you don't need to understand everything to trust the one who does.